It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman, and this show is brought to you by emailrevealer.com. Check out my website, emailrevealer.com, and catch your wife cheating online, or your husband. Let's see. If you're new to the show, this is the first time you're tuning into the show, please check out oppermanreport.com and check out the member section. Because we're always constantly adding new content, original content to the member section where you could join up and subscribe. And I'm really trying to work on a big push this week to get a whole bunch of new subscribers because we're just about to launch. I've been talking about it on that AM station in California, and there's a lot of expenses associated with it. I'm going to have to do a lot of publicity and stuff to get the ball rolling there. So really, if you support the show and you really like what you hear, check out the Opperman Report member section and join up to help support the show. Tonight, our guest tonight was recommended to us by Betty Metzger, who wrote the book about the burglary, about those activists that broke into the FBI headquarters. And she mentioned this guest. And I said, and I heard about him before. And I tried to locate him before. I think I tried to get him. But as soon as Betsy recommended him, I tracked him down. He's our guest tonight is Trevor Aaronson. And he's the author of The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. And you can check out, I got a link to that book right now. It's up on the Opperman Report, blogspot.com. It's on the blog. You can check it out there. And it'll be up in the Opperman Report bookstore by the end of the night or by tomorrow. So we have with us tonight Trevor Aaronson. Trevor, you there?
I am. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background? I was looking over your bio here. You got a dozen awards, fellow at University of California, Berkeley. Tell us about yourself.
Sure. So my background is in investigative reporting. I tend to do a lot of reporting on federal government agencies and law enforcement with a specific focus on using records and court documents to tell the stories as much as possible and leveraging data to tell the story as much as possible. Right now, I run the Florida Center for Investigative Reporting, which is based at the university of Miami, and then I also contribute national security work to The Intercept, which is part of First Look Media. For the specific topic we're talking about today, this research, which is about the FBI's use of sting operations in counterterrorism investigations, began when I was a fellow at the investigative reporting program at UC Berkeley in 2010. And what we tried to do was analyze the decade worth of prosecutions for counterterrorism in the decade after 9/11, and try to come to conclusions about it. How many of these more than 500 cases involved truly dangerous terrorists, and how many were people who were caught in sting operations and whose threats were exaggerated by government officials to some degree. And so that initial work in 2010 resulted initially in a magazine article, and then eventually in the book that was originally published in 2013. And fortunately for me, I guess, the FBI has continued to really use aggressive counterterrorism tactics since then and continues to. And so it's been kind of a cottage industry in some ways for me to continue to write about these cases.
Yeah, as long as they keep setting people up, you're in business, right?
That's right.
Now, so give us an idea. What are you finding with this work? What have you been finding out?
So if you look, for example, at if you just take, for example, the decade after 9/11, so it would be, September 11th, 2001 to September 10th, 2010. 2011. What you find is that there were more than 500 cases that the federal government prosecuted successfully and classified as terrorism cases. Half of those cases did not involve anyone that posed a direct threat to people or property in the United States. Half of those were, things like cases where someone was allegedly raising money for terrorist organizations, or someone who was charged with immigration violations, but who the FBI alleged was involved in some sort of terrorist activity. But after those, once you separate those and you look at the other cases, what you find is that in the decade after 9/11, there were more than 150 people who were caught up in informant-led sting operations. And what this is that after 9/11, the FBI set about recruiting an enormous network of informants to try to stop the next attack. Basically, the FBI was given an edict, never again, never another 9/11. And they recruited this massive network of informants. Today, there are more than 15,000 informants working for the FBI. And their job was to go out and find terrorists and bring them to the FBI. The FBI, in turn, when informants identify someone that they suspect might be interested in violence, and they might suspect this because they're at a mosque and someone says something ridiculous, like, oh, it'd be great if we, got a bomb plot together to show how we object to, American foreign policy abroad, they would then provide this information to the FBI, and through an elaborate sting operation, the FBI will provide an informant or an undercover agent to get to know this person and provide all of the means necessary, provide the weapons that they need for their plot, provide the money that they might need for their plot. And in some cases, when the plot is really nebulous, where it's just kind of a crackpot idea, the FBI through this sting operation will even provide the idea for the plot itself. And then they move these people forward and get them to act on the plot, to deliver bombs or to try to make bombs with materials that the FBI provided, and then they're arrested. And of course, when the case is announced to the public, it's not so much, hey, we found this guy who was mentally ill, because most of the men tend to be mentally ill to some degree, and we set him up in the sting operation. Instead, it's, no, we foiled this terror plot and we're keeping you safe. And so there are 150 cases like those in the decade after 9/11. By contrast, if you look at the number of cases where the defendant represented a truly dangerous threat, such as Fayez Shahzad, the man that delivered the car bomb to Times Square that fortunately didn't go off, or Najib al-Azazi was a guy who fortunately was captured before he delivered backpack bombs to the New York City subway system. If you look at those, there are really only about 5 cases in that decade where there was a significant threat of terrorism. And so what's happened is that the truth is that there is a threat of terrorism within the United States, but it's a measurably small one. There aren't a lot of terrorists, so to speak, operating in the United States during that decade. But by contrast, through these really aggressive sting operations, the FBI has successfully kind of manufactured, dozens of more cases. And what this has done has created a very damaging effect on Muslim communities in the United States, because in large measure, this has kind of exaggerated the threat of terrorism from within Muslim communities in the United States, because more often than not, American news consumers are only hearing that first day story when the federal government holds a press conference and says, hey, we foiled this terror plot and it's this Muslim man. And, most people aren't like me and, pay attention to these cases and pour through court records. And so they're left with the impression that, oh, the U.S. government caught another Muslim terrorist, when in truth, these people weren't capable of this crime, and for the most part were men who were mentally ill or economically desperate and were manipulated by the government. And it's also worth noting as like a data point, for example, that in the decade after 9/11, far more people were killed by lone gunmen like the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooter than were killed by, terrorists with Al-Qaeda or Islamic State sympathies. And yet every year the FBI is spending billions of dollars to capture terrorists, but the truth is that while they are out there, they're there in quantifiably few numbers, and certainly not to the degree that the FBI makes it seem through the use of these sting operations.
Yeah, that's true. When you think about it, it's really ridiculously small numbers of these foreign terrorists that are supposedly on our soil causing mischief.
Absolutely, yeah. In the FBI's defense, if you talk to the FBI about the use of sting cases, what they will say is, well, the guy that we caught, I have any weapons, and I know he wasn't actually in contact with a terrorist group, but he was out there and he was talking about it and he wanted to get involved. And so what we're doing through the sting operation is we're capturing him before he has an opportunity to meet a really bad guy who can provide the bombs that he needs, right? And that's a plausible argument, right? The idea that you are stopping them before they meet the truly bad guy who can help them deliver on their, evil deeds. But the truth is, if you look at all of the cases that we've seen of terrorism in the United States, there has yet to be a case where you've got this otherwise incapable guy who has violent aspirations but no means on his own, and he turns a corner and meets Mr. Al-Qaeda who says, hey, I've got this bomb if you want to use it. Certainly it could happen, but it just never has. And yet we have this enormous practice within the FBI to stop exactly that, which, as I said, is something that could happen, but there's no evidence to date that it ever has happened. And so we're really kind of, in a sense, guarding against the possibility that is remotely possible and has never been shown to be, something that did happen.
Now, does the FBI, do they get convictions on these guys? Or is there ever a defense that says, hey, this guy was entrapped, it was a total, it was no threat to anyone?
So for the most part, defendants caught up in these sting operations plead guilty. And part of the reason is that in the federal system, people charged with terrorism in these cases face mandatory minimum sentences that are just draconian, really. And they were legislated with the Khalid Sheikh Mohammeds in mind, like the truly dangerous guys. They came up with these, decades-long mandatory minimum sentences for punishment. And so, for example, if you are charged with, conspiring to use a weapon of mass destruction, you may face 35 years in prison if you're convicted at trial. By contrast, the Department of Justice often offers plea deals to these people for 10, 11, 12 years, and often they take it because they realize, well, if I take this to trial, I'll go to jail for 35 years. I can at least get out when I'm 30-some years old if I, take the 10, 11-year deal. That said, there have been 5 cases in which the defendants have argued entrapment, and so far none has been successful. Yeah. One of the most egregious cases was a case outside New York City involving 4 guys known as the Newburgh Four, and the lead defendant, a guy named James Cromedy, was a broke Walmart stalker with a history of mental problems, had no economic means on his own, and in fact, did not even know the name of the terrorist organization that the informant was claiming to be a part of. And what ended up ultimately happening in that case is that the FBI, like in all of these sting cases, provided all of the means and the opportunity, but also, even more egregiously, the informant admitted in testimony that he had offered $250,000 to James Cromedy to move forward in the plot, offered to buy him a barber shop, offered him various what are illegally called inducements that should have bolstered the entrapment argument, and the jury ultimately did not find entrapment. And I think it raises a lot of questions about whether a Muslim today charged with terrorism can effectively argue entrapment, whether that's even a defense for a Muslim charged with terrorism today. Arguing entrapment in any case with any charge is difficult because it basically requires the defendant to say, yes, you got me, I did that, but I wouldn't have done it were it not for the FBI government agent overwhelming my will. And it requires you to kind of build empathy from the jury, and the jury to be like, yeah, I could see that happening to me. He admits to doing it, but he didn't do it. The only reason he did it because the government forced him to do it, and that's a difficult defense in any case, whether it's a fraud case or maybe a bank robbery conspiracy. But when it's a Muslim charged with terrorism and it's a largely white jury, I think it's very difficult for Muslims to win on entrapment, and certainly the numbers bear that out. And as a result, the Department of Justice has a near perfect record of conviction on these cases, which obviously makes it much more difficult to force reforms when the Justice Department can basically point to the courts and say, well, look, juries are buying this, they're not having a problem with it, so why should we think there's anything that needs reformation?
I think I actually remember that case you're talking about. And there was really no plot at all. And these guys went on target shooting in the woods, wasn't it?
I think you might be thinking of a different one, but that was similar. You might be thinking of the Fort Dix Five, which was a group in New Jersey, and this was a particularly egregious case too. In that particular case, it was a group of largely Albanian men who enjoyed taking